Welcome back to the History of the Papacy podcast. My name is Steve, and I'm your host for this podcast about the history of the Popes of Rome and Christian Church. We are on Facebook and Twitter, and you can find both by searching for A2Z History. If you have any questions, comments, or feedback, you can always send me an email to my email address, steve@a2zhistorypage.com. Let us commemorate the Patreon patrons on the History of the Papacy diptychs. We have Joran at the Alexandria level and Paul the Magnificent at the Constantinople level. I will also introduce our latest patron at the Alexandria level, William. Thank you so much, William, for joining the History of the Papacy on Patreon. And thank you to everyone who signed up. The new and improved History of the Papacy Patreon is very similar to the old Patreon, but even better, you can follow the link in the show notes or search for the History of the Papacy on Patreon to find more. One great benefit is you will receive audio of the YouTube video only special, The History of the Papacy in 10 Minutes. We'll probably be putting out about 2 to 3 of those a week. You can watch them on my YouTube channel and then listen to them on the Patreon patron bonus feed. Look for those episodes to premiere on YouTube very soon. Thank you to everyone who listens out there. Today's episode is my introduction to a series that I'm doing on the development of book culture in Christianity. The end goal is to look at how the book, as a way of presenting and disseminating information, helps spread Christianity from its very beginnings all the way to today. This is really a look at the history of book production, publication, changes in literacy, and education. These are all topics that I love to learn more about and talk about. I see this as a journey for us all to take. One part of the journey is that all of these episodes will first premiere on YouTube and Facebook and possibly Twitter as live streams. If you want to see these episodes when they first come out, like us on Facebook and Twitter, and definitely subscribe and ring the bell on the History of the Papacy YouTube channel to get updates on all the great content happening there. I hope to see you on YouTube, social media, right here on the podcast, and the Patreon feeds. And I will talk to you next time. And here we are with the Codex. Thank you for joining me today on the History of the Papacy, an Agora Podcast Network member. I'm your host, Steve. I hope to talk to you soon about all sorts of developments in church and papal history and much more. And we talk constantly, and this is a really fun episode for me today. Today we have the first in an evolving series of episodes on book culture and book publishing in the ancient and medieval world, especially but not exclusively in the Christian context. This is a topic that has always fascinated me. I call this an evolving series because it won't come out sequentially. I'm going to revisit it over time. I have quite a few irons in the podcasting fire, but this is definitely a topic I want to discuss periodically and revisit. I got interested in this topic of book culture and publishing very early in life. My father is a printer as his profession, and I grew up in the profession. I practically lived in his print shop growing up until I went off to college. Printing was his passion, and he was at the very least a third generation printer. Our whole family was involved in the profession. My own immediate family, my brother worked there his entire youth. My mother worked there. My uncles, aunts, they all worked in and around the profession, and they all worked together for better or for worse. So I definitely want to look at the nuts and bolts of how books were made. It's like I said, it's been a topic since I was a little kid, seeing books flying off of the machine. And it just absolutely mesmerized me. Now, people are naturally focused on what's in the books, the content. And that really is the key element of literacy and literature. But I want to find out how these books were made. What was the publication process and how were they distributed? From made to published to distributed, the whole chain there is what I want to dig into. These are all really important topics because a book can be the greatest story ever told, so to speak. But if nobody has access to the ideas in the book, what does it really matter? Literary technology has shaped every aspect of history. When new technologies were discovered, they really helped some groups and hurt others. This happened often in Christian history, particularly the invention of the codex and the printing press. Changes in publishing technology are maybe even more important in Christian history than other areas of history, which we'll see. So much of my focus will be on how the various technologies of printing and publication affected Christianity and the papacy. I also eventually want to look at the process writers use to go from an idea in their heads to a published text in someone's hands. Like I said, this series will combine a number of different topics that I've always been interested in, and I hope they at least have some interest to you too. I need to give a really special thanks today to Ben Jacobs of the Wittenberg to Westphalia podcast, Gary Stevens of the History in the Bible podcast, as well as Andrew Mentz, who participates regularly in the various history podcast groups on Facebook, for helping me find some really great sources on this topic. Like I said, it's a topic that's always fascinated me, but in many of the nooks and crannies, it's been a hard time finding where to begin. So here is the beginning that I came up with. Today's episode is a short, hopefully short, history of writing materials and a very quick overview of the development of systems of writing, of how people came up with the writing and then the tools to actually write things down. So why do people write in the first place? And it's really to make a record of an idea for later consumption and later usage. Why and when did people start to write? Well, the earliest that scholars have come up with with writing is the Sumerians way back in Mesopotamia, about 5,000, maybe even a little bit more than 5,000 years ago. They started to record practical matters. Writing arose with agricultural societies all around the world: Egypt, Mesopotamia, China, Mesoamerica, and others. These agriculturalists became sedentary. They didn't move around like hunter-gatherers from place to place. They weren't nomadic. And they eventually became economic specialists. They needed ways to record important ideas, like an important milestones like harvest, transactions, trade, war, treaties, and most importantly to them, really sacrifices to the gods. Writing first was used as a practical tool to convey an understanding, which was mostly revolving around commerce. Later, writing would evolve to become a tool to convey scholarly and higher knowledge and academics and those types of understandings. Now, there was many different types of writing systems that have developed. This is an absolutely huge topic, and I'm not going to get into all the nuts and bolts today. I'll just touch on it at least. Now, there's really two ends of the spectrum. It's a pretty wide spectrum of what human beings have come up with on writing systems. On one side, there's something called a logographic system, and that's where pictures represent the meaning. You could look at things like early Chinese writing and hieroglyphics. Now, then somewhere in the middle, there's something called a grapheme or phonetic style writing, and that's where a picture or a symbol represents a sound or a group of sounds. And then you start to move over a little bit, and then you get into this idea of an alphabetic system. And that's where one symbol represents usually one phoneme or one basic sound. So like, B is one graphic, T is one graphic. And those are the very basic sounds that a language can make. And like I said, there's other systems that fall somewhere in between, but surprisingly enough, it's really those broad groups where it's alphabetic, something in between with this phonetic system where you might get a cr or something where there's a couple of sounds that come together that get a symbol or a picture that represents an idea. So a tree is a concept that's represented by one symbol. And there's many examples of that even, in our very day, we see different examples of those different systems. In early times, different writing systems lent themselves to different writing technologies. And even today, if you take an example, a traditional keyboard, like on your computer right here, it works really well for an alphabetic system, but less so with the logographic system. Something like a keyboard has to be modified to meet the needs of that writing system. Let's talk about the writing, the stock that's what it's called in the trade, or media. How do we store information? That's what we're getting at this point. How are we storing information, and why do we store information? Right now, we can store an incredible amount of information in tiny amounts of space. I mean, your phone can store, some phones can store 100 gigabytes of information just on the tiniest chip in your phone. It's amazing. But obviously that wasn't the case when maybe some of you out there were in college. You'd have to have a big disk that might have only held one 30-page paper, and maybe some of us who are even a little bit older couldn't even put that paper on a disk. You actually had to print the 30-page paper or type it out. I mean, the first real system of conveyance of knowledge was through oral tradition. That's the original cloud storage. One person told a story to the next person, to the next person, to the next person. Now, scholars credit this oral tradition with very high fidelity, especially for a system that's passing on information from one person to the next. But that's really with big ideas. It doesn't work quite as well for the details, and it's not verifiable. If I say that I have 60 bushels of corn in my backyard and I just tell you it, you have to take what I've said on face value, or you physically have to go count the corn. But if I've written it down on a piece of paper, that's a different story. It's verifiable. I can see on the paper, okay, he said he has 60 barrels of corn, and I go back and I look at my records, and then maybe I do a physical inventory of the corn, but it's there, and my records can be verified against that, and I can pass that paper along many times, and that paper or that documentation of what I said is always there. The first way that we really know of that people wrote down in traditional writing was on clay tablets. And they used something called cuneiform, which is really the earliest form of writing that we have. And that's where you push a stylus, or kind of like a pen, into wet clay that's molded into a form. You let the clay dry, and there you go. You've got a document. There's some pros and some cons to that. A positive thing is clay's cheap. It's everywhere, or it's most everywhere you can find clay. There's no ink or paint or anything like that required, and it lasts a long, long time. It's very robust. Now, there's some negatives, though. Clay's heavy. Once a a piece of clay that's dried, that's the size of, say, your laptop, that's a pretty heavy piece of documentation there. It's not easily transported. And because of its size and weight, a writer must be economical in their writing. It's really the 220 characters of early human history. It's just not an efficient way to write more complicated, longer texts. And it doesn't have a lot of information storage capacity. Even if you look at the records, the archaeological records, they might find tons and tons of clay tablets, but it's not really a ton of information. You know, the most massive library, it's a lot of writing, but in the grand scheme of things, it's not the most efficient use of writing. Let's take a look at the next big innovation in writing, and it's a pretty big innovation, and it's called papyrus. Papyrus is a thin sheet material which can be used with an ink or paint. Papyrus is a product that comes from a plant. It comes from a sort of thin grass-like plant that has a triangular stalk and a puffy top. It kind of looks like a makeup brush. And they usually, this papyrus plant, or the many variants of it, there's thousands of different genuses, I guess you call it, of papyrus, but they mostly grow in watery or wet soils. Importantly, this plant, or a version of the plant, grew in and around the Nile River area in Egypt during ancient times. And it also grew all across Eastern Africa and some parts of the Mediterranean in the appropriate climate. I mean, it wouldn't grow in like the desert, but if there was places that had that wet soil conditions, it grows. As far south as Madagascar, it can still be found today. Interestingly enough, that the plant that the ancient Egyptians used to make papyrus is almost extinct in Egypt, the country proper, today. This plant can grow quite tall. It grows it can grow small all the way up to about 16 feet or 5 meters. And there's many different grades of the plant, and different qualities of the plant, which translates into different qualities of papyrus. Now let's talk a little bit about the production process. How do you make papyrus, basically? So you peel the outer green layer, and they would use that for making reed baskets and that sort of thing. But that left a fleshy inside that was actually edible, and it was really high in sugars and carbohydrates. The people would cut the peeled stalk into thin slices. So since it's a triangular stalk, they'd cut a triangle piece, rotate it, triangle, triangle, triangle into the middle. They'd soak those slices in regular water for about 3 to 6 days. And the longer the soak, the darker that these strips of plant material would get. You'd weave those slices together into a generally rectangular shape. I mean, not every strip was exactly the same, so you'd get a little overhang on each side. But it really wasn't a complicated weave, and you could weave a pretty big sheet together fairly quickly. Then what they do is press that sheet under weights for several days. And during that time, these natural carbohydrates and sugars would basically meld that sheet together. They dry the sheets and then trim them to size. Now, the pros and the cons to papyrus are interesting. It made much thinner, more usable sheets than a clay blocks. And it was made from an abundant material. These reeds grew everywhere. Clay can be tough to get depending on where you are, especially in quantity. papyrus was very easy to write on and easy to collate many sheets together in different forms. We'll talk about that in a later episode. You also had a flexible size format. You could make really big sheets. You could make really small sheets, and it was pretty easy to do that. Now, some downsides to papyrus is it wasn't very flexible or durable, and it wasn't flexible either. The strips could become unglued with repeated use, and then, if you crinkled the pages, turned the pages a lot, or in the scroll context and scrolls, rolling and unrolling would loosen up that binding that held those strips together. Papyrus lasts a long time in the hot, dry climate of Egypt, but less so in the humid areas of, say, Europe or the Middle East. That's where the glue starts to fail. And it's a kind of a stiff material. Like I said, it's not very flexible. The real problem is the failure point of the material is in those strips that are glued together. Interestingly enough, some of the very earliest Christian documents, like the Gospels, the letters of Paul and et al., etc., the Book of Acts, and even those non-canonical Gospels, they were originally written on papyrus. Papyrus became less used in later times because of the quality issues, as well as it just became a lot less accessible in Europe because once Egypt was cut off from Europe because of the fall of the Roman Empire and then the Islamic conquests, access to the raw material and even the finished material became much less common. Let's talk about another material called parchment. It's another huge innovation in technology over the clay tablet and kind of marginally over papyrus. Basically, what it was that a single format sheet was made from animal skins. And it's usually from larger land animals like cows, goats, and sheep. There was a special type of parchment, like the highest grade parchment called vellum, which was made of calf skins. Let's talk a little bit about the production process. It's kind of a disgusting process. It's pretty gross, and it's akin to leather making. So if you know anything about how leather traditionally was made, you'll know that it wasn't it was a difficult process. But there were some slight differences, which we'll get into. Leather uses a lot of something called tannins, which toughens up the skins, but also keeps them supple. Parchment uses a little bit different process to make the skins thinner and a little more rigid. So basically what they did was they they killed the animal, then they skinned it. Now the skin, once they skin the animal, it's covered with it, the fur and the hair, and on the one side, and then the other side's completely covered in all the fat and the gristle and all that stuff. All that needs to come off of the hide. What they would do was, after they had skinned the animal, they would preserve them as best as they could with salt, then ship them to the parchment makers. Because, once you've killed the animal, it's going to start degrading pretty quickly. So even before you could get it to the parchment maker and the parchment maker could actually start making it, that skin could degrade enough to make it not usable. But so anyways, once the parchment maker was ready to start making parchment, they would soak the skin in a solution of lime, the chemical lime, over the course of several days. This makes a basic solution. Acidic solutions are really terrible for preservation of animal products, specifically for the most part, and especially like written documents, acid is not great. But so this basic lime solution, it loosens the hair follicles from the skin. And after a couple of days of soaking in the solution, they could pretty easily scrape the fur off the one side. And then what they do is they stretch the skin out on a frame, get it really nice and taut. And then the meat and the tissue and all that yuck on the other side would get scraped off with, for the lack of the better word, a medieval looking like half circle knife type thing. And they just scrape that off. So once all that yuck and, like I said, tissue and all that stuff is scraped off, the skin is dried. And then once it's dried off, it's cut from the rack. After a little sanding, finishing, you've got a brand new piece of parchment. And the same process was used for vellum or whatever skin you're using, a very similar process. But they might take a little bit more time to make the finished product a little smoother and a little nicer. Now you've got the pros and the cons of parchment. It's very durable and it can be scraped and reused many, many, many times. You write on it, I don't like what that parchment says. You just scrape all that off and you can scrape it pretty well. We'll get into some things about scraped parchments in upcoming episodes. An interesting thing about parchment over papyrus to a certain degree is that it's very easy to write in duplex or on both sides of the sheet. Then obviously clay tablets, that's really hard. Parchment holds up pretty well in a variety of climates and weather conditions, although it does have a tendency to warp in changing humidities. And that's why like really, really old parchments, they're really careful about controlling the humidity. Obviously, you've seen the production process is difficult. One thing that can be a good thing or a bad thing is that the sheet size is really determined by the size of the animal. So if the animal has a blemish or if something gets messed up in the parchment during the production process, then it's either they have to work around that blemish, the writer, or that you have to make smaller sheets out of that. So that's really a major stumbling block of parchment is the quality of the skin depends on will impact the quality of the final product. So there really can be a wide variety and wide variation. A goat is going to give you a really different size sheet than if you can get a really nice big sheet off of a whole side of a cow. But if that cow got a scar or something like that, that's going to impact your parchment. Parchment largely replaced papyrus in most applications, and especially in church and government uses. It was just a nicer and better material. Things like the Codex Sinaiticus and the Codex Vaticanus, which were both written in the mid-300s AD and still are extant today, were written on parchment. That amazes me. There's documents that were written in the 300s and even earlier that we still have today that are still legible and usable. That blows my mind. But parchment of many materials, if it's held in some kind of decent conditions, will last millennia. And even in cases like the Codex Sinaiticus, it was almost better that nobody was really working with it that much. It was in a cabinet, or actually, I think that one might have been buried inside of like a cell that had been closed off, and it was preserved enough, but not so much that it got messed with too much. The last step really that we'll talk about today in the actual media is paper. And we'll go over paper really quickly. Paper doesn't play too much into early church usage, but it was already in use in China around the time that the Gospels were written in the first century of the Common Era, and even before that time. And there's some debate on the exact date that paper was invented. They're fairly certain that scholars, that is, are fairly certain that paper was introduced to Europe during the Middle Ages, and it's first mentioned by a monk of Cluny in 1102, to be exact. So it was probably around at least sometime before that. Now, the paper production process is pretty interesting. Basically, what happens is they take fibers of different plants and they mash them all together or pulp them. And there's a couple of different ways that you can do that. You can beat these things, these plant materials together with hammers and just beat them, take a big mallet, etc. Or they can be put in, crunched up kind of, and then boiled in water and acid and different chemicals and made into a pulp. They'll also take rags that have been made from cotton or linen or other things, and used rags, and then mush those together, pulp them together, and make into this wet mass, which is spread over a screen and then dried. You have all sorts of different plant options you can use. You could use hemp, flax, bamboo, rattan, mulberry. And the Chinese, long before paper ever was introduced to Europe, they had experimented with all these different plant materials, and different plant materials give you different textures, different smoothnesses, colors. And they experimented all the time. Where you'd use a certain process and certain materials to get the best quality or the cheapest quality, but a lot of it. You want mass production. You want certain characteristics. The Chinese and the groups in between all played with all of that. The pros and the cons are paper is a wonderful material for writing. And it's cheap and it's relatively easy to make once you know how. It's really in the knowing how. It's lightweight like papyrus, but it's much more durable than papyrus. But you really do have to know the process. And it took a long time in China to develop the whole process. There was a technological learning curve to it. And it really was, to make a decent amount of paper, it's an industrial process. So it took a time for like Europe to get up to speed to make mills. And you need to figure out the right raw materials to use. And although it's cheap, even to make the highest quality papers, it's relatively inexpensive. It's not as long lasting as parchment. I'm going to go through a couple of others of materials that we'll come across in later episodes, but there's not quite as much to them. Like there's bark. You can write on bark. Thin strips of bark that are peeled off of a tree. You carefully trim that or peel that off, and you can get, pretty small sheets of paper, if you will, that you can write on, and that works well enough, but it's brittle, and you can only peel so much bark off of a tree before you kill it. So it's either got to be off of trees that have been felled, or you can just take a little bit off the tree. And only certain types of bark, like birch bark, really work well for this application. Then you have the wax tablets that were really popular in Rome, and they were really a Roman innovation or invention. And it was wax that was melted into a wooden form, and you'd basically have a tablet, if you will, that you could write on with a stylus, and you could write fairly easily on that. And you could, if you made a mistake, you could use the stylus to flatten it out, the mistake you made, or you could remelt that wax and reuse it because the wood was durable. it worked very well for its purpose as a quick and dirty, like, not to sound cliche, but quick and dirty back of the envelope calculations, but it wasn't a long-term storage option. And if you were trying to put together maybe 2-3 tablets, that's the most you could really do before it started to get unwieldy. Another really cool one was actual sheets of pounded out lead, like almost lead foil. And a hard stylus could be used to make impressions on the lead. And scrolls and whole codices were made of lead, and they found these all over the ancient world. Lead is really quite easy to work with. It has a low melting point, and it's very malleable. It's also it's a pretty common material that can be found all throughout at least the old world. But it would have been expensive. It's still a metal that has to be ored and smelted and all that good stuff. So it was only used for really, really important documents, religious documents, and the famous Roman lead curse tablets that they found tons of them in Bath in England, in Roman Bath, where the Roman person would write like a curse against someone. I want that against somebody because they wronged me. And then they'd store that tablet, and like the gods would read them and wrought their curse on the person. Also, I mean, they wouldn't have known this at the time, but lead can be quite toxic depending on how you're using it and how careful you are with it. So you definitely wouldn't want to be using that all the time. Let's talk a little tiny bit about writing materials and writing utensils, and we'll start off with ink. There were a variety of recipes of ink in the ancient times. Then the basic recipe evolved all throughout the ancient times, really into the Middle Ages, but the Roman recipe would have been soot. So basically burning something down into fine carbon. Better quality soot came from things like resins and other materials. So they were really looking for a dark, fine soot. You could get that actually from charcoal if you really, really worked hard to ground that down. But their technology to grind it down wasn't as good as if you could just get nice natural soot. They'd mix that with egg whites and honey, and the egg whites and the honey basically worked as a binder and a smoothing agent and a drying agent of the ink. You mixed all those things together, but it really wasn't easy. You'd really have to grind them and mix them and grind them and mix them. They were type of things that didn't naturally want to come together. And there you did. You had basic ink that you could use. They also, it was kind of unusual, but you could use black ink from cuttlefish, which was called sepia. And that was one kind. And then there was also there was red and green ink that was also used. The red ink in Roman times was used primarily for writing the title of a book. And the red ink was called rubrica, and it was also used, most commonly used to write the headings in the beginning of books, so the title of the book and the author, or the heading of a law. And that rubrica became synonymous with the laws themselves. They called the laws rubrica, and that's where we get our word rubric from. There was we get into the Roman times, into the Middle Ages, there was some more complicated but more effective recipes for ink came along. They would use something called oak galls, which are kind of weird growths on oak leaves caused by wasps laying their eggs into the leaf buds of the oak tree, and the tree's immune response is to grow this hard coating over the wasp, and it looks like an acorn kind of without the top. These were really high in tannins, and they would impart a color and durability to the ink. They were said to like bite into the paper better, and that's where we actually get our word ink from, and costume, which means to burn in. They would mix that oak gall with gum arabic, which is the dried sap of acacia trees, and that would thicken the ink, and that did a much better job as a medium and as a drying agent than either egg whites or honey would. They did have pens and pencils. I mean, they needed a tool to write with, commonly enough that they would use reeds and or quills for ink, and quills were the feathers from certain birds, and some birds were better than others for writing. Then you had different qualities of reeds as well. Reeds from Egypt, or reeds from this place, reed from that place. Generally, quills were better than reeds. These were definitely more difficult to use than what you would think of in a modern pen, but they worked well for their purpose. Lead was used, the metallic lead was used oftentimes to draw light lines on paper or papyrus or parchment, and that was used to create the guidelines to either write on. Think about it when you were in kindergarten or grade school, you'd write on the lines, make sure you write on the lines, or to delineate your columns. It was also, it was never really widely used for actual writing, though. It was mostly used for page formatting in the modern parlance. Now, pencil lead that we use today in our pencils, I don't even know if I have one. Oh, our common, my own favorite here, Ticonderoga pencil. Best pencils in the world. We call it lead commonly, but obviously everybody knows that it's not made out of lead. It's made out of something called graphite. But when graphite was first discovered in England, they called it black lead. And the modern pencil lead is a mixture of graphite and clay mixed together and then encapsulated in wood. They had pencils like that pretty early in the 1500s. I will just quickly, bear with me. I'm going to talk about paint. And that's a huge topic that I'll probably address in more detail later on. But really, there's two really basic types of paint, oil-based and then not oil-based. And the simplest recipe for paint is you take an oil and you take a pigment, and it's some sort of, it could be a mineral or a plant-based pigment, and you mash them together, and it's called mulling. Each pigment has a kind of different properties and gives you different color values, but you mull these together and you take an oil. You've got to be a little specific with the oils, though, and the most commonly used one was linseed oil, the oil from flax plants. And that is a really good oil because the way it dries hard. A lot of oils don't dry that way, but so basically they take these pigments in powdered form and they just mush them together with the oil until they get the consistency that they're looking for. And then they paint with them. Another type of paint that was commonly used was called tempera paint, and that was where egg whites were mixed with pigment. And both of these pigments can be really, really long lasting. The Dura Europos house church used some tempera paints, and they were visible up until the times before I think they were destroyed. But pictures of them have obviously been taken, and there's maybe hopefully some left in there. But so that can last hundreds and thousands of years, these types of paints. Let's wrap it up really quickly with generally paper, parchment, and other stock was something people purchased. And you could purchase or make your ink if you were a writer. And humans and human beings, they have infinitely great ideas in their heads for painting and for writing, but they've got to find a way to share them. By voice is good, but it hasn't always worked to convey an exact message over time into different groups of people. So how about something more permanent? Let's invent, I don't know, writing. You need something to write on, though, and it needs to last, and it needs to be easy to use, and it needs to fit the purpose. This, as we see, is a constant process to develop materials that help us record our ideas the best. Now we're using electrons and Facebook Lives and YouTubes and digital recording tools, both written and verbally, and new ways to record and share will just constantly evolve because we need these ideas. We need these tools to record our ideas. So next time, we're really going to start talking about how the paper and the ink and the other materials were organized to help writers and share their ideas. So I hope you join me for that next time.